Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and streamed and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Vienna Live with Simone Morrow and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded and distributed live stream, please go to LinkedIn live video feed, the link to which I've just placed in the chat room. Tonight, our featured guests are Gino Cattani, Professor of Management and Organizations at Stern Business School at New York University, and Simone Ferriani, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at University of Bologna and at the Bayes Business School, University of London. Welcome, Gino.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having us.
Gino, so tell us, what is your definition of innovation? We hear that word very often. You're a specialist in it, one of the foremost specialists. What does it mean?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, and instead of providing my own definition, I think given also the title of the show, I would probably draw from Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who actually defines innovation as an act of creative distraction. And the beauty of this definition is that it covers different types of innovation, from incremental, like minor improvements of an existing product, to system level innovations that are obviously more radical types of innovation. So I think that instead of providing another definition of innovation, going back to some of the classic work of foundational work of Joseph Schumpeter would be a useful starting point for anybody who wants to understand innovation. One thing I want to stress also to set the tone for today's discussion is that much of the existing research on innovation has focused on conditions that actually enhance the ability of a firm, for instance, or of an individual to generate innovation, whatever type of innovation we are talking about, but slightly less on how that innovation eventually gets accepted and takes hold in a particular field. And that is what we will discuss today, and we will provide our own take, if you wish, on this important aspect of the overall process of innovation.
And Gino, just to clarify, so when you're using Schumpeter's definition, creative destruction, it sees innovation not as only a good thing, but also a bad thing. So for instance, before we would send mail letters by post, and then when email came along, we stopped doing that. So that really destroyed an entire industry of sending letters. Is that right? So there's kind of a good and a bad part.
I think that could be true for many innovations. Some innovations may be labeled as bad innovations because incumbents are kind of feel threatened. Some innovations may actually turn out to be more positive after some time. Correct? It's like the atomic bomb obviously was the ending point of an important innovation process. But I mean, nuclear energy is now again under discussion as a possible solution to global warming, correct? So it depends on even societal reaction to different types of innovation, especially when these innovations may have a huge impact on not just on the economy, but society at large. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the meaning of any innovation can change over time, and how the innovation is perceived, not just by incumbents, but also those who are, let's say, the users or consumers of that innovation.
Simone, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure, Simone. Thank you.
Simone, so tell us, why focus now on the reception of innovations? In other words, when you come and Steve Jobs or one of you comes to somebody and says, listen, I've got this great idea and this is what it is. Why is why did you guys focus now on how the other person understands the innovation as opposed to the intrinsic worth, as Gino was talking about, these big things that just eventually are going to change society? Why research what the first person you approach thinks about it?
Thank you, Simone. This is a super interesting, super important question. And just like Gino, who drew on Schumpeter, I want to draw on another great scholar. His name, perhaps less known than Joseph Schumpeter, but certainly very famous among scholars in psychology. His name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He is considered to be the founding father of positive psychology. And we, in our own research, over the years, we've been building a lot on his ideas and the intuition, but essentially one of the great theory that he developed is called the system view of creativity. And the central idea of the system view of creativity, which is actually fairly intuitive, is that creativity does never exist in a vacuum. It always exists in a social system. A social system that decides what counts as worthy of recognition or not. And essentially, the point is that the new novelty in general cannot really stick unless it's recognized. And it cannot recognize unless it aligns in some way with the social system. And the way Gino and I have been thinking about this kind of alignment between the new and the social system is a sort of a bridge, establishing a bridge between the old and the new, the marginal and the mainstream, the outside and the inside. And the gist of the research that we are going to share today is exactly, this, establishing a bridge based on the way in which we communicate, based on the words that we use in order to convey our ideas, particularly new ideas, which I think it paves the way very nicely to the study that we would like to share with you guys. So perhaps this is a good moment also to share the screen with you and show you our slides. So let me bring that up. You should be able to see the title slide now, Framing Innovation. I hope you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Continuing along this line, essentially, what is this bridge that we've been focusing on in this particular project is the communication-based bridge. In simple term, the project is about, in a way, cracking the code for how to communicate an idea so that the receiving end, as you rightly describe it, really pay attention and say yes to that idea. And think about it. Innovators, entrepreneurs are full with fresh ideas, but how do they talk about those ideas? What word do they choose in order to frame those ideas to win the attention of their interlocutors and the audience, typically the audience who are the resource holders, right? That's the big question that we've been tackling with the project. And the question formulated in simpler terms, perhaps, is how should innovators communicate their new ideas to win audiences' support? This, I know, in some respect, may sound as a kind of a simplistic question or maybe an obvious question, but the reality is that most of us don't really think very strategically or let's say strategically enough about how to properly frame our ideas or innovation in order to maximize their impact. And the reason why we don't do that is because we tend to take for granted communication. So before taking you through the findings of the studies, of this particular research, I just want to share a bit of an intuition that for us was kind of the inspiration actually to set up the journey, the inspiration that got us started thinking about this question. And the inspiration is really rooted in a fairly popular concept, I guess. I'm sure many people have heard the notion start with why, or the phrase start with why. It's the big kind of notion that was made famous a few years ago by Simon Sinek in probably one of the most watched TED Talk ever, with I think over 60 million views, or maybe even 70 at this point. So in that talk, Simon Sinek, but also in his book by the same title, Start With Why, you can see the cover on the left-hand side, he basically argues that if you want to essentially gather or rally people around your ideas, the best way to do that is to talk about the why, okay? Why you're doing what you're doing. And I'll explain the details of these in a moment. But essentially, his point is that when you share the purpose or the deep reason behind your idea, that helps connect with the idea in a more kind of personal manner, okay? Because people on the receiving end can kind of appreciate the beliefs and motivation that are driving you, okay? Okay. However, this view is not univocal. It's not univocal because there is another camp represented in this slide by Wharton School professor Adam Grant, who wrote another best-selling book called Original, where he takes a slightly different position. He argues that essentially innovators who are championing new ideas should privilege more of a concrete framing by spelling out the how more than the why. The how they should implement their ideas, or they would implement their ideas. And Adam Grant in the book doesn't really provide any strong empirical evidence to this claim, to this intuition. But the idea is essentially that, framing the new around kind of lofty purposes is more at risk of clashing with your audience notion of what is possible, their deep-seated beliefs. So instead, you think it's safer and also smarter to show people the practical step for turning new ideas into reality. That, of course, opens up kind of a tension, right? Is a why or a how oriented framing more effective in gathering or eliciting, say, attention and support for one idea? So take the case of an entrepreneur who is, striving to attract financial resources to start a new venture, okay? And so should this entrepreneur focus on why the idea is desirable, or should the entrepreneur instead promote something more concrete, a more concrete and practical focus on how the idea works when pitching to an audience of, say, investors? These two views open up a little bit of a conundrum. What should you emphasize more, the how or the why? And that's why we got hooked by this, right? Whenever there is a tension or a friction, that's usually a good space, a sweet spot for a researcher. And so to find out, essentially, we designed a series of experiments where we asked two groups of people, a group of, say, investment novices, and also a group of investment professionals, say venture capitalists, angel investors, as opposed to people with no experience in making investments, to evaluate an entrepreneurial idea communicated as a pitch deck, a classic, the standard way in which ideas are communicated by entrepreneurs, with a pitch deck, a set of slides, okay? And then essentially we invited, the participant, whether novices or professional expert investors, to evaluate this pitch deck based on a real product prototype. In this particular example is a wearable sensor, and one of these pitch deck emphasizes in factual terms what this sensor did and how to use it, while the other pitch deck emphasized why you might want it. Everything is the same in the pitch. It's only a minimalistic intervention. In one slide, the slide about the product. In one, we emphasize the why, while in the other one, we emphasize the how. That's the treatment, okay, in the experiment. And then essentially we examine whether the responses of these two groups to the idea varied when the entrepreneur framed the solution in terms of concrete action, how does the product satisfy specific goals, as opposed to high-level purposes, why the product is desirable. And that's basically what we got running this experiment. When the target audience is the novices, as anticipated by Simon Sinek, novices seem to appreciate the idea more, okay, when it is framed in abstract wide terms. Okay, so the why-laden framing is more appealing to novices. They like it more and significantly more. But things change, and that's probably the most fascinating twist of the story, because as Grant suggested, on the other hand, it's exactly the opposite when the evaluators are expert investors. Expert investors, as you can see by looking at these histograms, they appreciate the idea more when it is framed in concrete how terms. Okay, another way to put it is they tend to focus, they are more likely to appreciate these ideas when they are framed in concrete terms as opposed in why terms. So why this finding? Why do we observe this interesting pattern whereby what's desirable for one type of audience is not necessarily desirable for the other one? Well, essentially, the explanation is fairly intuitive. Expert investors, like venture capitalists or innovation managers. Actually, in our experiment, we run, as I said at the beginning, I only showed you a couple of experiments here, one with novices and one with venture capitalists. The reality is that we ran multiple experiments, to make sure that the results were robust and consistent, across across different population. But essentially, for experts, these are people who have spent typically years learning, how to spot good ideas, and so they know what they look for, right? What to look for. On the other hand, novices, they are not used to evaluating new ideas. However, they tend to focus more on whether an idea sounds exciting, sounds beneficial, in other words, on its desirability. That's why pitches that explain why an idea matters really click with novices, but they don't click as much with experts, because it helps them see the purpose, and that is what matters to them. Experts, on the other hand, already understand kind of the why, right? An idea might be valuable. What they really want to know is how it's going to change the world, how it's going to work in practice, and whether it can actually be pulled off. So to conclude, some kind of implication, more practical implication that can be derived from this kind of findings. In general, think about this. When people who have the resources, who hold the purse strings for new ideas, like angel investor, venture capitalists, crowdfunding, funding bodies, innovation managers, those who control the resources, are always trying to back, the next big thing. However, even the experts get it wrong, and especially in the early stages. And that's why I'm sharing all these famous brands from great companies. What do these brands have in common? Well, essentially, Apple, Southwestern, Airbnb, Ramin, Teach for America, all of them were originally, when they were originally pitched to the investors, they were turned down, not once, but multiple times. So an interesting question is, why couldn't those early audiences, those investors, see the potential? Was it maybe because the entrepreneurs, didn't use the right framing? Was their fault for not explaining their ideas in the right way? Maybe. We cannot be certain, but what we can do, what we know for sure, and what we are confident about, is that the language that it's used to communicate a new idea is real power. Okay, and depending on the language we use, we can shape how those people we are targeting see the ideas that we are trying to convey and maybe sell. Now, our research essentially shows that whether you frame your idea on why or how matters, and it can make a significant difference. And essentially, so it's why or how. It's not the answer is not black and white, clearly, based on this finding. Whether it works better to frame an argument in one way or another, it really depends on who you're talking to, okay? Who is at the receiving end of your pitch. So innovators championing ideas have a much better chance of winning the attention of novices, like, for instance, friends, family members, or maybe general crowdfunders, if they emphasize the purposes and the goals behind the idea. On the other hand, the approach is suboptimal when dealing with a target audience of experts, such as investors, angels, innovation managers, and venture capitalists. To win expert support, you'd better signal to them how you concretely intend to achieve your goals. Now, to kind of wrap up what I just summarized, we also created kind of a entertaining, amusing video that really takes you through the core of the research journey, and I would like now to share it. I think it's more memorable than me or Gino speaking. It provides the message in a more humorous way as well. So let me now sharing the video that wraps up the entire research. I hope you are able to hear the sound, which will start in a moment.
What is the most effective way to pitch a new idea? In one of the most popular TED Talks ever, Simon Sinek argues that the best way for mobilizing people and attention around an idea is to frame our message by emphasizing the why of what we're trying to achieve. Communicating an idea's purpose, according to Sinek, is key to win an audience's support because it allows it to understand the goals behind it. But is this truly the best way to hook your audience? Maybe not. In his best-selling book, world-renowned organizational psychologist Adam Grant counters that framing new ideas around lofty purpose is more likely to challenge deep-seated beliefs about what is possible. Hence, he argues, a concrete frame or how you plan to implement your idea should be preferred. So, why or how? To address this question, we designed and ran a series of experiments where an innovative idea is pitched to two different types of audiences: an expert group of professional investors and a non-expert group of lay evaluators. We then examined how they responded depending on whether the idea was framed in terms of concrete actions or high-level purposes. So, who's right? Is a why or a how-oriented framing more successful? It depends. A why frame works best with non-experts, increasing their chance to appreciate the idea by 25%. Conversely, emphasizing how the idea could be implemented is much more effective with experts, causing a 44% boost in their preference. It is little known that the founders of many iconic ventures such as Southwestern Airlines, Apple, and Airbnb were repeatedly turned down when originally pitching their venturing ideas to professional investors. Did they employ the wrong framing? Possibly. Our findings indicate that innovators have a much better chance of winning non-experts' attention if they emphasize the purposes and goals of their idea. But this approach is suboptimal when dealing with an audience of experts. To win expert support, you'd better signal them how you would concretely intend to achieve your goals. So, why or how? If you know your audience, you know the answer.
Okay, there you go. So that's it. I think this is perfect timing for handing it over to Gino for the continuation, the second part of this presentation. So Gino, over to you.
Thank you, Simone. I'm very happy to share with you some new findings. The project that I will briefly summarize is actually a new project. The paper that Simone mentioned in his presentation is actually already published, and at the end we will provide also a link to our websites where you can find also the title of the paper if you're interested. So this paper that we are working on is still a work in progress. This new project essentially further delves into the importance of the language in framing novel ideas. But the twist here is that we distinguish between different types of innovators, innovators that are essentially coming from the field in which the innovator is trying to make to have an impact, and innovators that, on the contrary, come from more distant fields. And we look at how the expertise distance of the innovator from the target field may eventually affect the extent to which evaluators are more or less favorably inclined towards the idea. This book, so if you go back, Simone, one second, this book, Outside the Scientist, was for us a source of inspiration. It's a very interesting book that shows the role of innovators coming from more distant fields than biology, because the book talks about major contribution to biology science. This book actually shows that many of these innovations sometimes came from innovators from different fields, not fully certified or trained biologists. Another important message of this book that is actually resonates, if you wish, with our research agenda is the importance of engaging in a translation effort. So, in other words, using the language in which the target audience, in this case, other biologists, are familiar or fluent, or with which they are familiar. So just to give you a sense of what we are doing, we are essentially looking at different types of innovators, some coming from, as I said, the target field, others coming from a more distant field. And the basic question that we are trying to address is how and when are innovators who vary in their degrees of outsiderness are more or less likely to achieve recognition for their new ideas. Just to visualize what we are trying to do, consider life sciences as the target field, and then look at innovators, consider innovators that might come from life sciences, so basically from the same field to which the innovator is trying to contribute, or an adjacent field that is formally distinct, but to some extent overlapping with life sciences, genetic engineering. And this type of innovator for us is not an insider, is like a marginal type of innovator. And then you consider a more distant in terms of expertise, and a more distant innovator coming from philosophy, who actually is the prototypical example of a full-blown outsider. So essentially, our central argument that draws from existing theories is that innovators outside the target field usually struggle to receive positive evaluation from field-level audiences. There could be many reasons. In our research, we focus primarily on the perceived expertise distance between the target audience and obviously the innovator, depending on how distant the innovator's field is with respect to the target field. That could be life sciences or any other field. So in this project, we identify two different ways, drawing on social categorization theory, that could help the innovator, especially outsiders, to really overcome or reduce the penalty that they typically face. For today's presentation, I just want to focus on the one that is more consistent with the topic of the show, and in line with what Simone was talking about, essentially what we call outside-in bridging through language alignment. What's that mean? Well, essentially, to elaborate our arguments, we draw from a well-established research tradition, language expectancy theory, which emphasizes the importance of being fluent in the language of the target audience, essentially. So the idea is that in order to gain the attention and possibly the support of the target audience, is very important to use the language that resonates with the language in which the target audience is fluent. The reason why that is the case is that by using resonant words, the target audience finds those words more familiar, more comprehensible, and that obviously predisposes those audience members more favorably towards whatever idea is presented to them. So our central claim is that outsiders who use the language prevalent in the target field are less likely to elicit negative evaluations, and under certain conditions may even elicit more favorable evaluation than either insiders or marginal innovators. Obviously, we provide in the paper a theoretical justification for why we have this expectation. I don't want to get into the details of our theoretical arguments. If there is some question towards the end of the presentation, I'm more than happy to address it. But here, I just want to share with you some experimental results. Again, we ran some experiments to get closer to the mechanisms. And as our central finding is that when outsiders use a formal language, in this particular case, the business language spoken by business-trained evaluators, they don't elicit more negative evaluation than insiders or marginals. In other words, if an innovator is an outsider and is trying to pitch a new idea about a new venture to an audience of business-trained evaluators, and they use a language that is informal, is not, in other words, a language that resonates with business-trained people, their chances of getting attention support obviously is much less compared to the same idea pitched by insiders or marginal. But if outsiders pitch the same idea using the language with which in which the evaluators, business-trained evaluators are fluent, then the penalty of the outsiders essentially disappears. This is strong evidence that using the language of the target field is crucial to really get attention and support on the part of an innovator, especially when the innovator comes from a distant field. Again, we try to replicate the same results in a different field. In this case, is life sciences, where we have a different type of evaluators. These are even more sophisticated evaluators because these are not, like in the previous experiment, senior undergraduate students in business. These are life scientists with a degree, with a PhD or postdoc degree, and so more socialized, if you wish, into the profession, and therefore even more sensitive to the type of language that the innovator uses. And again, what we observe consistently with the previous results experiment, we observe that when the outsider innovator pitches the same idea using an informal language, obviously the penalty will be evident. But when the same innovator pitches the idea using the formal language that a life scientist, a seasoned life scientist is familiar with, then the penalty disappears. Again, strong evidence that using a language that resonates with the members of the evaluating audience is crucial to, if not remove completely, but definitely is critical to attenuate the outsider penalty. So what is the more general implication of these experiments? Essentially, the importance of using words that resonate with the insight. So with basically resonates with the type of language that insider evaluators are familiar with, and therefore words that they understand. That obviously predisposes those evaluators more favorably towards ideas coming from outsiders. So essentially, the first key takeaway, if you wish, is learn how to speak the local language, the language of the target audience. And our experimental results provide a strong evidence that the ability to speak the language of the target audience essentially has a significant boost in terms of predisposing the audience more favorably towards the idea of an outsider. The other important implication, if you don't become fluent in the language of the target audience, is essentially to rely on an outside-in translator. So in other words, and we have anecdotal evidence corroborating this claim from other studies, that essentially relying on someone who can speak both languages, the insider language, but also the outsider language, and is able to make this translation to help the outsider innovator, that is an important another way through which you can essentially use words that resonate with the insight. And so either you do it yourself, or you essentially find a partner that can help you in that endeavor. And that is the way by which you try to connect the outside to the inside and reduce or possibly overcome the outsider penalty. Some of these key insights have been discussed in a recent paper that Simone and I have published in the MIT Sloan Management Review this year. Is lessons learned from outside innovators, how outside spark innovation. Is less academic as a publication, so it's probably more managerially oriented, but distills some of the insights that Simone and I over the years have tried to generate in our work. The work that Simone presented, the one that I just presented, and also other papers that address similar or related issues that we published in the past. Thank you so much.
Okay, are there any questions or comments? So I will ask the final question while everyone can think about if they have any questions or comments. The final question first to Simone and then to Gino is, what should we all think about, Simone, the next time someone tells us their great idea?
So if you are on the receiving end, and so you are listening to someone's idea, I think the point that we are trying to making is that you should be careful, because in thinking about how that idea is being conveyed to you, sometimes the fault of some of those entrepreneurs that I mentioned earlier, who struggled a lot at the very beginning, sometimes it took even years before they managed to persuade the audience, was that they were not actually using the right levers, the right words, the right framing when they were talking to the audience. So when I'm on the receiving end, I should, in a way, if I want to be supportive and not just, being the kind of devil's advocate, but also constructive in my feedback, I should always try to help them, articulate their idea, having in mind precisely who they want to talk to. So depending on who they want to talk to, they have to think strategically about how they want to tell the story that they want to tell. And as a coach, I work a lot with entrepreneurs and startups and innovators. This is something that I do on a routine, on a regular basis. This kind of training on finding the right words, the right framing, and also thinking very strategically on when you want to use those words, depending on the particular target audience that you have in mind. And this audience, of course, can change over time. It can be, depending on whether the idea is in an early stage of development or in an advanced stage of development, your strategic concern may change as well. At the very beginning, you may be more open to the idea of involving, less expert type of investors or supporters like crowdfunders, family and friends. That's typically what happens. And at that point, usually you really want to think about the desirability, because you want to make sure that they connect with your beliefs, and that's the key. But over time, if you are good enough to scale the idea, and to become more solid and to validate the business model, and at that point you will probably, become more attractive to more professionalized type of investors, like, for instance, business angels or venture capitalists. That's when it's probably time to switch the emphasis of your communication in a strategic manner, so that you become more and more appealing to that type of audience. Communication is something that is not monolithic. It should change. It changes over time, because over time your priorities change, and when your priorities change, typically your audiences change, right? That's the key thing to keep in mind. Thank you.
If you allow me to add something very briefly before moving to the next question. It's kind of interesting after talking to a couple of at Stern we have NYU, we have two incubators, and talking to both directors of the two incubators, essentially one of the basic insights is know your audience and speak the language of the audience. So which is pretty much what even Simone was referring to. So, and the basic takeaway is that sometimes even great idea don't get the support that they deserve, because those who are pitching those ideas don't know how to pitch it, or they don't use the right language. So that is actually one well understood challenge that some prospective entrepreneurs or innovators face, especially at the very early stage when they have to present and communicate their ideas.
And Gino, so any final thoughts then? What do you want us to think about when someone pitches us a great idea?
I mean, I think that probably I want to say, I mean, with Simone, we have studied the importance of language, and we are still working on this. Obviously, this is not like a panacea, like a solution to all problems. And obviously, that does not downplay the importance of the idea in itself. In our experiments, we keep the idea constant just to be able to control for the quality of the idea, and we selected ideas that were eventually supported, or ideas that actually got support through Kickstarter and so on and so forth. So that obviously is a given. But I think that what it would be interesting for the future is to also, because nowadays we have much more powerful tools to do it, is to really study more systematically the role of language, and probably you can think about even the role of social media nowadays, correct? And not just for innovators, but more in general in shaping our life. But I mean, language is really the most important means through which we communicate ideas, correct? And try to persuade. And now there are tools that also amplify the power that those who know how to use some of these tools might exercise and have in the future. I mean, the role of influencers in our society is very important, correct? In that case, it's not maybe technological innovation what they're promoting, but more like in a new lifestyle or new products that they might sponsor because they are behind them. So that is studying the language and the nuances of the language, I think, is very important. And now also we have the tools to do that in a more systematic way.
Okay. Any final thoughts? Any questions? Okay, then let's
there you go.
Oh, hi,
Can you
Dr.
hear me
Davis.
now, Tim? Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you to the two gentlemen who've been talking. This is certainly out of the ordinary for Vienna Live, which I've been used to for a long time now, but very interesting. Very, very interesting. Even at my young age of 92, I can appreciate it. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, our pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
And by the way, one final thought, if you allow me to do that, I mean, I always like citing this example, which is emblematic. It's not about an entrepreneur, but one of the most important social scientists of the 20th century, Herbert Simon. He actually, in his Nobel laureate lecture in economics, basically said explicitly that although he was not a trained economist, his PhD was in political science. In order to convince economists that some of his ideas were really shedding new light on economics, but also challenging some of the assumptions in economics, he basically had to learn the language of the economists by teaching himself calculus. So the only way to make a convincing statement about the importance, not just the novelty of his ideas, was to really communicate them using the language that economists are more familiar with. So basically, it's another great illustration of how being an outsider to some extent, or maybe a marginal, you can increase the chance of having an impact on the inside by using a resonant language, basically mathematical language, to communicate ideas that eventually turn out to be path-breaking, and that's why he got the Nobel Prize.
Let's see how we can stay in touch with Gino, and we can continue the conversation. So it's stern.nyu.edu, And Gino, people can reach out to you if they have any questions, and they can find your
Anytime,
articles here.
anytime. Sometimes if I, for my, because of my work, I'm traveling, I may not respond right away, but I typically respond relatively quickly. So anytime, feel free to reach out. I will be more than happy to address whatever question you may have. Yeah.
Fantastic. So that's stern.nyu.edu. Reach out, please feel free to reach out to Gino. And Simone, he has two universities here. The first is the University of Bologna, and that is unibo.it. And Simone, people can reach out to you if they have any questions.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure always to answer questions and engage in conversation. I always find this opportunity very productive. So don't hesitate. I'd be very happy.
Fantastic. And the second school is Bayes Business School. It's bays.citystgeorge.ac.uk. And so again, you can find Simone's contact information here. Please don't hesitate to reach out to him. Thank you so very much to Professors Gino Cattani and Simone Ferriani.
Thanks to you, Simone. And
Thanks to you.
Participants. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
So let's see, take a look over here at Vienna Live's website, www.simeonmoore.com. And we can see here that it's easy to become a sponsor of the show. For just $5 a month, you can receive a Vienna Live celebrates 5 years mug. And if for $10 a month, you get a 5 years mug and a Vienna Live City tote bag. If you, for $20 a month, you receive 3 music recordings of your choice in digital CD format. And then about coming up next Wednesday, we have Alun Wad, New African Orleans, in his 6th and latest album, New African Orleans, released by Enja and Yellowbird. Bass guitarist and composer Alun Wad explores the multiple junctions between his native West African rhythms, the Afrobeat and Juju rhythms from Lagos, and the brass band repertoire immortalized in New Orleans. Let's discover New African Orleans. That is next week, next Wednesday, Alun Wad, New African Orleans. As always, all information about upcoming shows may be found at www.simeonmoore.com. Once again, thank you so very much to Gino Cattani and Simone Ferriani. Thank you to Vienna Live's corporate and individual sponsors. Your ongoing support allows Vienna Live to operate as a freely accessible public service. Thanks to my cousin Mike, a marketer from Layer App. If you're an architect or an engineer, they have really cool tools you should check out. Thanks, of course, most of all to you, our participants who make it all worthwhile. From London, England, New London, New England, and New York City, New York, goodbye, and see you next Wednesday.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.